This is How to Argue with DocTomPepper, part of the Critical Thinking series. Hello and welcome to this new video in the Critical Thinking series with me, DocTomPepper. In this short instructional video, I'm just going to show you the basics of how to put together an argument. So the building blocks of critical thinking, premises and conclusions, as well as the two things that can go wrong with an argument, the sort of metrics that we judge its value on, which are validity and soundness. So the aim is just to give you a good understanding of the very basics of critical thinking and argumentation. If you enjoyed the video, please do like it. If you know anyone else that might like it, then please do share it with them. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more content. I'll tell you what's coming up at the end of the video. Till then, enjoy. The first thing you might be wondering is, why do arguments matter? Maybe you're not a very confrontational person, you don't get into one-on-one arguments that often, so why do you need to learn about them and critical thinking? Well, it's because people are often trying to use arguments on you to convince you something that's true when you might not otherwise agree with them. And they'll often try and use sleight of hand to try and get you to that conclusion. So examples might come from politics. Politicians are very often trying to convince you of something they think is true. TV shows, so a show like The Wire, over 5 seasons, has a sustained argument against the war on drugs, particularly in Baltimore. So the conclusion is something like the war on drugs in Baltimore is not working, and the premises are the evidence that it shows you along the way. Examples of the policing not working and what goes wrong with it. Movies as well might have arguments in them. They'll be a bit more succinct. So a movie like Star Wars might have a conclusion like being a good person is better than being a bad person, and it'll show you evidence of why along the way to get you to agree with that conclusion. Books will have arguments in them, even quite out there books like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is a sustained argument against war or certain aspects of war. Essays, obviously academic essays, particularly philosophy essays, but also scientific papers which have a set conclusion, and the evidence they'll provide to convince you of that conclusion will be the experiments they've done. YouTubers, obviously including me, including most political YouTubers, but even something like an instructional video of how to fix a radiator, the conclusion in that argument will be this is the best way to fix a radiator, and they'll show you evidence to support that through the video. Adverts as well will use arguments on you to try and convince you of something that's true, and we'll see an example of that in a second. If you're more confrontational, you might also argue with people in pubs, just when you're out for a drink. Salespeople are obviously trying to argue with you, essentially. They're trying to use an argument to convince you something that's true. Essentially, everything we've just listed there, they all want to influence your mind with arguments, and critical thinking teaches you to analyse those arguments for yourself, determine whether they're good or bad, and so whether you should agree with the conclusion or not. There are 4 key definitions you need to be aware of when you're starting out with critical thinking. First of those is a premise. That's a statement that supports the conclusion, and the conclusion itself is a statement that's supported by the premises. That'll all be fairly clear in a second when we see how that works and how they fit together. The other 2 key definitions are valid or validity, which means that the conclusion is supported by the premises, and sound or soundness, that an argument is valid and all of the premises are true. Those last 2, validity and soundness, those are the metrics we're going to use to determine whether an argument is good or bad. So let's see how they work. This is the typical layout for an argument. So we have here P1, which is premise 1, P2, premise 2, and C for the conclusion. So any argument, no matter how complex, will simply be variations on this theme. It might include more premises, but they'll always be laid out like this. Sometimes I like to lay it out like this as well, just to make it clear what's happening. So you have the conclusion that's being supported by the premises. So if they're bad premises, the conclusion won't be held up. But if they're good premises, they support the conclusion in the right way. So this is a classic example of a syllogism, which is an argument with 2 premises that lead up to a conclusion. An argument could have more premises, but a syllogism is always just the 2. So here we have P1, premise 1, Socrates is a man, and premise 2, all men are mortal. For the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So we can see that argument is valid because the premises support the conclusion in the right way. There's just no way to argue with that, if it's sound at least. And we know it is sound because Socrates is a man, or was a man, and all men are mortal. And so the premises do stack up to the conclusion in the correct way. So this is a valid and sound argument. You can't disagree with the conclusion once it's been set out. Let's move on to some more real-world examples. You can see here the kind of argument that might be concealed in an advert for Pepsi. So premise 1, you like drinking Pepsi. Premise 2, to drink Pepsi, you have to buy it. And conclusion, you should buy a Pepsi. So we can see here that it has the right structure to get you to the conclusion. And obviously what the advert will try and do is try and remind you or convince you that you like drinking Pepsi to confirm premise 1. It won't say to drink Pepsi you have to buy it for premise 2, but We know that's there. It's kind of a hidden premise that assists the argument, and it tries to get you to the conclusion you should buy a Pepsi. So that's how adverts try to use arguments to convince you of a conclusion. Turning to something with a bit more relevance from the world of politics, so we have premise 1, someone that is self-serving, deceitful, nepotistic, out of touch, cognitively impaired, and incompetent should not be president. And of course, been very careful to just pick insults that could apply to either side there. Premise 2, my opponent is all of those things. And conclusion, my opponent should not be president. So again, that's the underlying structure of a political argument, the kind that's been trotted out time and again in the recent presidential debates, the 2020 debates if you're watching from the future. They won't necessarily lay it out this clearly and explicitly because it's not really a politician's job to lay out an argument specifically. A politician's job is just to get you to the conclusion so that you vote for them. And in this case, the conclusion is simply putting down the other person, leaving you with only one option, which is the person presenting this argument. It has the right structure, but here the opponent is probably going to try and argue that the premises aren't sound. So they'll probably attack premise 2 and say that they, the opponent, are not actually all of those things. If you're attacking the argument from outside, you could also say premise 1 might be dodgy. Maybe you think that someone with all those impairments can be president, and who knows, maybe they can. But to attack this argument, you need to attack either the soundness, so the truth of premise 1 or premise 2, or the validity, saying that the premises don't support the conclusions in the right way, but it looks like they do to me. To help you understand what a good argument is, it'll help to show you how an argument can be wrong. So here's an example of a lack of validity in an argument. Premise 1, London is the capital of England. Premise 2, Cardiff is the capital of Wales. And conclusion, Elizabeth II was born in 1926. So in this example, premise 1 and 2 are definitely true, and the conclusion is also true. The problem is the structure. It doesn't have the valid structure that we looked at before. The premises don't support the conclusion the right way, or even really have anything to do with the conclusion. So this highlights why validity matters in arguments. It seems a very obvious thing, but we are covering the basics here. Your premises need to support the arguments like they've done in the previous examples, in a way they're not doing here. Now we're going to look at an argument from film criticism. So premise 1, Star Wars is a great film. Premise 2, Disney's Star Wars are not as good as the original. And conclusion, Disney Wars is terrible. So I want to avoid questions of soundness just for now because the premises are subjective, but just look at the structure here. So Star Wars is a great film. Okay, let's accept that. Disney Star Wars are not as good as the original. Let's accept that too. But that doesn't actually mean that Disney Wars is terrible. It just means that the new Disney Star Wars aren't as good as the originals, which means they're just somewhere below great. So even if you accept that premise 1 and premise 2 are true, you don't have to accept that this argument is valid, and so you don't have to accept that the conclusion is true. Here's a slightly more out there argument to again show you how the logical structure of an argument really works. Premise 1, all cats have 8 legs. Premise 2, hawks are a type of cat. Conclusion, hawks have 8 legs. So this argument does have the proper structure of an argument. If premise 1 and premise 2 were true, they would support the conclusion that hawks have 8 legs. As I hope you know already, the premises aren't true though, so this argument fails because of its soundness. The premises aren't true. But if they were, it'd be a perfectly fine argument. So thank you for watching. I hope that's given you a good understanding of the basics of critical thinking and the key terms within. I'll go into all those concepts in more detail in future videos. I'm hoping to put together something on ad hominems pretty soon. I'm also going to be watching the presidential debates this week, so I might have something to do with those if I can find like any kind of solid, rational, logical argument in that like hour and a half. I'll do my best to analyze it and put it up on this video. I might even try and do a contest to find out who's better at arguing, Trump or Biden, which should be fun. And of course, if you liked the video, please leave a like, share with anyone you think might like it, and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Till next time, goodbye.